Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us at the Microsoft Power BI UK user group. My name is Leon Gordon. I'll be your host for this evening, and we are joined by none other than Microsoft Data Platform MVP Rishi Sapra. So, Rishi, thank you very much for joining us in today's session. We're going to be here discussing Power BI governance. And before I hand over to Rishi for this session, most of you who are familiar, I'll just go through a few of the ground rules for today's webinar. So as always, this is going to be very much an interactive session, so please do feel free to ask questions using the Q&A functionality throughout the session. And also, as I mentioned, please do try and interact with us as much as possible. We put this content on for yourselves, not only to learn from, but to grow from as well. So without any further ado, I'll give a brief introduction on Rishi and then hand over for today's session. So Rishi brings a strong mix of commercial and technical skills, combined with, I can testify, a solid academic background. So he was actually got a first-class degree from the London School of Economics and is a chartered accountant with over 12 years experience in Big Four consulting and financial services, prior to pursuing a career in Microsoft Power BI and business intelligence in general at Altius, which then in turn became Avanade. So on a technical side, Rishi, as I mentioned, is a Microsoft MVP, and he's also very recently become a fast-track recognized solution architect as well. Rishi is a recognized thought leader throughout the Power BI community, writing blogs, articles, and speaking at different conferences and user groups. And we were very fortunate to share the Power BI bootcamp conference this prior weekend, which was a fantastic event. And he also runs two core communities, which is the Learning Data Insights and the Power Platform for Finance group as well. I don't know where you get all the time from, Rishi, but that's for another discussion. So again, I'll hand you over to Rishi now.
Great. Thanks very much, Leon. Everyone see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's coming through fine.
Great. Brilliant. All right. As you'll probably see, it's a presentation, but I've kind of done this as a course. So what I'm trying to hopefully do is publish this on Learn Data Insights, which is learndatainsights.com, as a self-paced study course, because there's so much content on this area. There's no way we can do it justice even in an hour. I'll do my best and I'll try and cover as many of the topics I can as a high level, but then hopefully try and make as much as I can of it available afterwards for people to go through themselves. So there's 6 core kind of modules we're going to look at. We're not going to do the knowledge check today, and we'll have a look at. So we'll start with the kind of introduction. So it's what we're looking at here is a way to manage Power BI within a large organization typically. And I say this has come from years of experience working with large organizations at Altius Avanade. And what I've seen with a lot of those clients is Power BI has grown up from a grassroots level. So people have come across Power BI in their roles and seen the benefits of it. And then the adoption has just kind of grown from there. And which is great, and it's definitely what Microsoft wants, but it also creates challenges similar to how we used to have with Excel, where lots of workbooks, there's not proper control and governance around them, not single versions of the truth, and we can end up very easily with the same kind of situation in Power BI. Lots of workspaces, lots of PBIXs, all over the place. People don't really know what data's out there, how to use it, and there isn't enough control over how that data is accessed, managed, and shared. So that's what we're going to cover today, and I think it'll be very useful to Power BI administrators as well as the kind of business leaders who want to come up with a plan for how Power BI should be managed. I've said in here 2 to 3 hours. I mean, I don't know how long this will take to go through, but obviously today we've got an hour and I'll go through as much of the kind of content, at least at a high level, that I can. That slide is there. So what we're going to do is look at 6 core areas. So the Power BI adoption roadmap. So actually, I came up with a lot of this content before this was released. So if you haven't seen this already, and then I've gone back and actually, hopefully it's all been kind of quite well aligned to my thoughts, which is really great. So this is a article, quite long series of kind of articles written by Melissa Coates and Matthew Roach from the Power BI product team. So Melissa Coates from Coates Data Strategies. If you haven't seen that, actually, maybe Leon, if you could put a link to that in the chat, actually, just in case people want to reference that. And then we look at Workspace, scope and creation, tenant admin security, this concept of managed workspaces, which we're going to cover, which is kind of for your enterprise BI, roles, licensing and training, and then also monitoring and support. So let's start with the kind of Power BI adoption roadmap. So as I say, a lot of this is on the articles, and what I've tried to do here is provide a bit of a summary and kind of outline how we could use this as a framework to understand where we are today and where we want to get to. And one of the main things I wanted to bring out from this, and I think if this is the for me, this is the main mantra, this is the soundbite of what Power BI governance tries to achieve. And it's discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge. So when people we'll talk about Power BI governance and you see the controls and processes, it looks like it's very much a command and control type operation where, we're putting these rules in place, you have to do this. Actually, what governance is really about is about user empowerment and user enablement in line with these guardrails, but allowing people to do their jobs more efficiently. So we're actually going to, provide people with the right tools, with the right support, with the right flexibility to be able to use trusted data to build their reports, for example. So it's really a beneficial thing for everyone in the organization. And so that's really your discipline at the core, is your standardized artifacts, and your flexibility at the edge is your ability to use those to build thin reports on top of shared data sets, for example, or be able to have team and personal BI as well as the enterprise BI. That's your kind of self-service, and there's a place definitely for both. So and this is really that difference between enterprise BI and team departmental or team BI. So this is where there's fewer audiences for these, and potentially more people producing this content. But actually, enterprise BI is what we really want to make sure we manage much more closely, much more carefully. That tends to have a larger audience, and also tends to be fewer people who build the enterprise BI content. Let's say the idea of self-serve BI is that other people can also then use that. So these are just the areas that are covered as part of the Power BI adoption roadmap. So you've got data culture. So this is your behaviors and your norms, and it's very closely related to Power BI adoption. So I'm not going to go for all of these, but just at a very high level, an immature state of this is where you've got very chaotic, few formal processes, very little in terms of strategic plan, and lack of oversight and visibility into self-service BI operations. And let's say I see a lot of very even large organizations who are at this level with data culture when it comes to things like Power BI. But where you really want to get to is where we've got behaviors and actions and that are very much in line with how Power BI needs to be used. We've got continual learning. This is a journey. This is also, one of the other key takeaways I think from this is that Power BI governance is not a one-hit wonder. It's a continual roadmap, a continual journey that you're on. So you need those key KPIs. You need to measure success and understand what you're doing and where you're going. Executive sponsorship. This is also something that's quite key, and the reason for that is because if you try and do this purely from a bottom-up approach, and typically that is how things like Excel governance has come about, very much from a bottom up. The challenge is that when you try and do things that crosses boundaries of the teams that you work in, you may not have the authority to be able to implement some of these controls and processes, or to build that kind of data culture to have that impact. So to really be able to change the culture of an organization, that has to come from the top, which is why you need this executive sponsorship. So level 100 is there's awareness of at least one executive, and level 500 is you've got executive support for driving this data culture. Content ownership. So we're going to look quite a lot at this about the difference between enterprise BI and self-service BI, but these all kind of relate to how content is owned and managed within the organization. So again, level 100 is everything's just self-service, everything's freeform, everyone can do anything they want to, and most of the time the default Power BI is used in its default way, which is you have a single PBIX file that has your Power Query connections, your data model, as well as all your reports in there, and that's just lots of those potentially duplicated data all over the place. Level 500 is where we've really got measures in place. We've got, making use of things like shared data sets, data flows, external tools, and we've got that enterprise BI really well managed, which is what we'll look at today. Content delivery scope. So again, quite related, looking at the difference between enterprise BI and departmental BI. And initially, this level 100 is kind of self-service and uncontrolled way. Level 500 is proactive, using things like the activity logs to understand how Power BI has been used in the organization, how content has been delivered. And we'll see again how that comes into data sharing and things like that. Center of Excellence. So we'll talk a little bit about Center of Excellence as well. So a lot of people, when they hear the term Center of Excellence, they think it's just good developers. And then there may be some development going on in this team, but the real goal and objective of this team is not development, it's actually enablement and empowerment. So as I say, this is why this team, and it might not be a team, it might just be a federated set of users across business units who are experienced, but they're the ones who are able to help others in the organization and to be able to provide some of this governance and control. And so I say we'll have a look at what that exists. I mean, to say that one or more COEs exist at level 100 might be a little bit ambitious there, but level 500 definitely, where we could get the effectiveness of the COE. Governance. So governance here is referred to the specific policies and procedures. So level 100 is where they don't really exist. And things like the tenant admin settings will just be set as default values and never looked at or reviewed, whereas level 500 you've got governance priorities, transparency and communication, and that's key, especially with things like we'll look at with tenant admin settings. You can't just put them into place and say, right, let's change our tenant admin settings, let's not worry too much about what we put in there, and then let's not bother communicating it to people. That's an absolute recipe for disaster. Mentoring, user enablement. Again, we keep coming back to this. It's one of the objectives and responsibilities of the COE, but really helping people and enabling them. So there's level 100, there's very few resources available. With level 500, we've got user enablement, mentoring, training is tied into that, and community of practice is your internal community. So again, we've got some content creators, but unrecognized efforts. But here we've got an actual internal, an active, vibrant internal community where you've got bi-directional feedback loops between these champions and the Center of Excellence team. User support. There is a lot of overlap between all these areas, and that's intentional because it's painting a picture of what this looks like in an organization where users are supported. There are controls and processes in place, and again, initially, and this is what I see with a lot of organizations, is there's individual business units and people who get infused by Power BI and they will help people informally, but there's nothing formal in place. There's no real community forum. Whereas level 500 is where we really have an active internal community with KPIs that measure community engagement, community satisfaction. It links into the help desk. So when people call the help desk for support, and also the Center of Excellence. And we use things like automation. So the scripts to, like we'll see, for example, to add people into AD groups when needed. System oversight. So this is looking at kind of doing the monitoring. So level 100, tenant settings, no real use of activity logs, and architecture is without a plan. And we look at level 500, we can see that actually we're using things like the activity log and the API data. So let me just that screen is used to inform and improve adoption efforts. And that was their settings. So just some key takeaways from that. There's a lot of information there. To say it's quite a long series of articles. It's very accessible and consumable though. So do take the time to read it, and it will really give you the framework and really paint a picture of what you want to try and achieve with Power BI governance, which is why I put this as the opening chapter. So one of the key takeaways on here is to stage this. As I say, don't just say, okay, right, tenant admin settings, we're going to change them tomorrow and it's done. Actually, you need to go through those, document them, document your rationale for how you want those to work, and then communicate those to users ahead of time and say, at the end of the year, we're going to implement this. This is why. This is how you can get access to this functionality if that's what you want to do. And it comes back to this point that you need to document what you're doing. And it's not just a technical activity. It's all about user education. It's all about user enablement and really engaging with that user group. And this is hard in a big organization with lots of spread out users, with lots of politics, with lots of, lots of things going on. This is not a particularly easy thing to do. As I say, it's a position of empowerment rather than command and control. And think about how you measure success. So vanity metrics, I took that from the lead startup. It's it's avoiding things of saying, oh great, our reports are distributed to 3,000 users. That means they must be brilliant and we've got great Power BI adoption. Or even if you look at how many people view reports, that's a better measure. But it's more than that. It's much more about how Power BI is being used and how adoption and governance plays a part in that. And think about when you're measuring success, or when you're trying to think about what you want to do, think about improving these three. So data democratization, how you can give people access to data and tools and systems, how you can have a process for people to find data. And for me, I think there's some gaps in this at Power BI, and I think it's actually getting a lot better. But for me, what I've always advocated is that the Power BI service needs to be this one-stop shop for data discovery. Now we're tying into things like Azure Purview and all of that. And I think Dataset Hubs has got discovery. You can make your data sets discoverable. We're moving leaps and bounds in this direction, and this is really good. This is one of the key things I think that we're going to get to with Power BI, and also data literacy. And I think one of the things again we'll look at is that where we have consumers, we tend to just kind of assume that everyone we give a report to will know how to use Power BI, and that's just simply not true. The Power BI team have done a great job in trying to make things more obvious, like they've done recently with tooltips, and make the drill through actions more obvious. But there's still user education required there, and so we can't just assume. Even though we work with Power BI every day, most people in the organization don't. So we need to make sure that we educate them on how to use Power BI. Cool. Any questions on that?
So far, Rishi, the majority of the questions have been aimed at the presentation. So we do have a question asked in regards to, and sorry, let me just grab it. So what's the application you're using to present with?
It's presented in HTML. So it's I'll go through it later. I'll do. It's a session itself in terms of how we're doing this, but this is content I'm trying to put onto LDI around how it is. But hopefully people like this.
No problem at all. And there have been some comments on when you will elaborate and go a bit more in depth. And I've mentioned the fact that we are constricting a lot of information into an hour's session, and a course will be available following on from this.
So now we're going to look at Workspace scope and creations. And I mean, that was also covered the entire scope, right? But it was to really set the framework for what we're doing. So now we can look at a few more things in little bit more detail. So we've got the rest of the 40 minutes now. I say to go slightly slower. That does mean I will cut out some of the content in here. So for start, Workspaces. So Workspaces is key to how we understand how content is organized within Power BI. So most people, I imagine, who are in this group will understand what workspaces are and understand them as the place from which apps are published. But also, it's not ideal to just add people to workspaces to give them access to content. That's accessing content directly in workspaces is really for Power BI developers. So it's for collaboration and not really distributing content to an audience. That's what apps are for. And then we have different levels of access that we can apply with the workspaces. So a viewer is the lowest role, and they can only view items. So we can add people as a viewer into the workspace, but an app is better for multiple reasons. And then these are the roles where we then collaborate with other developers, and there's slightly different permission sets on these. But one of the really important things to notice is that if we add someone in as a non-viewer role, so contributor, member, admin, then row level security doesn't apply to them. So we really need to be really careful about how we do this, because again, what we want to do is make sure that we're sharing content in the right way. So row level security is one of the fundamental concepts for that, and we want to make sure that it applies. So again, it's really meant for Power BI developers who are able to see all the data. That's the point. So how do we kind of get a handle on the workspaces and content that we have across our organization? So if you're a Power BI admin, you can go into the admin portal and you can get a view of very high level view of the number of dashboards and reports that you've got and which of those are most used. I think it talks about this idea of most used packages, which isn't even particularly relevant. So what you can do instead is build your own reports. So you can get data from the REST APIs. Actually, I think this was supposed to be a hyperlink. I can definitely find a hyperlink to that, to the REST APIs documentation, as well as Microsoft have also provided some PowerShell scripts. And actually, ADF, if you look at Just in justb.dk, he's done a recent blog post series on how to get data from the REST APIs into ADF, via ADF, sorry, into say blob storage or something like that. So you can automate collecting that data as a Power BI admin, and then you can build your own reports of it. So, you know, we've got the composition tree and things like that, where we can start to understand how our content is broken down by how many are, you know, personal workspace, how much content's in personal workspaces versus how much is in group workspaces, how what the number of artifacts in a workspace, how many data owners do they have, which of them have the most artifacts, which of them have the most usage, because you can also tie this into activity logs. So every time someone views a report or does anything in a Power BI service, it's logged. So if you tie that information together, you can get a really good view of what's going on across the organization. And one of the key points to bring out here is that not all content is equal in Power BI. And this, you don't want to try and manage everything. In a large organization, if you try and do that, you won't have the resources to do so. And you'll run out of time, you'll run out of resources, and it's just not going to be productive because you'll be so scattered. So what you really want to make sure that you control centrally and that you have more governance and control over is enterprise BI as opposed to team or personal or departmental BI. So how do we identify what that enterprise BI looks like? Well, actually, and I'm using the term managed workspace to refer to the content that is hosted, that hosts enterprise BI content. So for a managed workspace, perhaps the content has well-built data models where there's strong potential for reuse of certified data sets. The content potentially is distributed widely across the organization or to an executive audience, and probably, you know, connects to these enterprise strategic data sources. That's probably a very key one, but also potentially has sensitive data that has specific access or data sovereignty requirements. Now, again, one of the key things with managed workspaces is that actually, if you have Power BI Premium, ideally per capacity here, actually, although you can make it work with PPU as well, especially in the dev and test world. But when you've got Power BI Premium, this is a good way for you to separate out your content, because your managed workspaces are hosted on Premium, and then all your other workspaces are on shared capacity. So your team and personal BI is on shared capacity, and your enterprise BI sits on Power BI Premium. So it's a nice logical separation. Things like tenant admin settings and all the rest of it will go across both of them, which for me is a little bit of a shame. I'd quite like to be able to manage some things on a content basis rather than on a user basis, which is what you do in the tenant admin settings. But that is what it is. So just to kind of summarize in terms of some of the key differences between what we're referring to here as a managed workspace and an unmanaged workspace. They'll be hosted on Premium and they can leverage that kind of functionality. It will generally be, the content on there will be endorsed, so it'll be certified. So that will mean that it conforms to certain standards and best practices, and that it's a single version of truth for that content. So Power BI experts from the Centre of Excellence, again, which we'll cover a bit more later, they will be admins or co-admins in the workspace. So they can help to provide some of that management and control. Access to the content will be managed by Azure AD groups. And this is the key thing. So even end user access to the reports and apps in this environment in your enterprise BI should be managed via AAD groups, including access to data flows, data sets. So developers who need access to data in there as well, do it via AD groups. High level of support SLAs provided for the content. Application lifecycle management will be in place for the artifacts, so we can use things like deployment pipelines. And we can, as of fairly recently, we can actually document automatically all of the metadata, and that's actually a premium feature using the new scanner APIs. So again, another reason to say this is what we're going to catalog, is the stuff that's on premium, the stuff that sits in enterprise BI world. And performance and usage of the content will be closely managed and monitored. Again, another thing that ties very well in with premium functionality, because you've got the premium capacity metrics app, you've got exponent endpoints to manage those data models in things like Tabular Editor, ALM Toolkit, and like. And how do we do access to content in a managed workspace? So it's very much AAD group driven. So here's a kind of example process flow, and you could do this using, say, Power Apps and Power Automate, where someone goes onto a SharePoint site, fills in a Power App form of the list of users they want to grant access to, and it could be internal or external potentially. There's then an approval workflow if they want to get access to that content. And if they do, if they get approved, they just get added to the right AD groups. So what you're not having is someone go into the Power BI service, go into your app and add individual names in. They've added a group, an AD group, and then people can get access to that content by being added to that AD group. And it's just a much better way of managing it, because you can start to align permissions across the different types of artifacts that you have across your entire organization. So really, really good way to do it. And I know this is challenging a lot of organizations, because the BI teams don't necessarily have control or access to create and manage AD groups. That's something that tends to be purely IT function. So again, this might be one of the cultural things that you'll need to deal with in the organization and think about how to make it work. So if we look at the workspace management process, so one thing we could do then is, for start, by default, everyone can create a workspace in the organization. So that's one of the tenant settings. And what we can do is it's enabled for the entire organization by default. We can enable it maybe just for Power BI admins, just as a kind of backup for our process. And actually then what we do is we create a process for people to request a workspace. So again, very similar process. You'll see this process flow is identical almost to the previous one, because they request a workspace. We ask them the questions on that form about how they're going to use it, what data sources they're connecting to, and we establish that whether we think, at least initially, it's enterprise BI or team personal BI. If it's enterprise BI and it's potentially needs to be hosted on premium in a managed workspace, then maybe it goes through an approval process, and the Centre of Excellence team get in touch and find out a few more details, and then if that gets approved, we set up the AD groups potentially automatically for them. And if not, maybe it just gets created automatically and we just document it. We just say, okay, you're responsible, whoever it is requesting for this workspace, you're responsible for the content on here. Do you agree to these terms and conditions? If so, away you go. It's self-service BI, right? We want to enable these users. It's not to stop them doing their job. But make sure we log everything, right? So the response to the workspace request forms and the approval process, if we log those somewhere in SharePoint, this metadata is going to be very valuable to us. It will be an input potentially when we do the estate monitoring, and it'll be useful for us to understand what's going on in a workspace beyond just a workspace name, which is all we have in Power BI Surface. We don't have any other detail. What's in that workspace? Who has been, who's requested it? Why? So all of these details, if we can capture, that'll be really good. And then also consider for the premium stuff as consider documenting the actual metadata. And there's a link here, and I can put stuff in the chat actually. That should work. Yep. Let me just stick that in the chat here. So it's by a guy called Tommy Paliga, who's also on the Explicit Measures podcast. If you guys are listening to any of this, I've been hooked on this. If you've seen me on LinkedIn, I've been going on about it. It's a great podcast. So it's Mike Carlo, Tommy Paliga, and Seth Bauer. Yeah, he's also produced a script here for running these scanner APIs using Power Automate and PowerShell. So this looks great. They're not the easiest things to just understand. So yeah, the fact that we've got some pre-built solutions from the community for that for free, I mean, you can't complain really. Great. Any questions on that?
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions there,
Sure.
Rishi. So Tripana just touches base on RLS, and they want to understand it. If you do give users contributor access, will RLS not be applied to them respectively for self-service?
What do you mean for some? Yeah, so if they've got contributor access in the workspace, they have edit rights on the content. Then no, OLS doesn't apply to them when they're going into it because they have edit rights. They can see all the data. It's only restricted to people with non-edit rights on the content.
Perfect. And quite a broad question from Muckle, and they ask, how are Azure and Power BI helpful together? So maybe you can just condense that into.
Sure. So I mean, things like the key things for Power BI governance perspective, I'll get 3 or 4 things. Azure Purview, that's one, definitely integration from a governance perspective. You've also got, for example, you could do some of your ETL in Azure. So one of the things I like to do, and I don't think I've actually covered this explicitly here, actually no, it is mentioned, is this concept of CDM folders. So what you can do is, again, when you have your data sources, rather than having, and you should split them out into data flows. So there's different options of data flows. And what you can do is you can obviously connect to, databases directly, or you can connect to, and you could do your ETL, your files, and you could do your ETL in a data flow. Alternatively, what you could do, and I really like this for an enterprise BI scenario, is you can do that in Azure and output that with data into a CDM folder, which is basically Azure Data Lake. That's all it is, Azure Data Lake. And CDM is one of the things in mapping data flows, for example, that you can output to, and it creates a metadata file, so .json file that contains the metadata of that. And then when Power BI data flows, you just say, I just want to connect to that data lake folder, and it just creates a read-only consumption view of that data. You're not bringing your data into Power BI. You're not having to worry about anything else to do with that. You're not even allowing people to edit it within Power BI. It's done all in Azure, and you're just exposing it as a Power BI data flow. So anyone who then has access viewer rights on that workspace can access that content. So you're not having to give people credentials. You're not having to give people access to mess around with the data flows and things like that. You're doing all of that centrally in enterprise tooling and making it available to people. So I really like that approach. That's definitely one for Azure. You've also got things like Azure information protection for sensitivity labels, which we'll cover next. And also, there was one other thing. I completely forgot what it was now. Well, Azure Active Directory groups. That was obviously the main thing. One of the main things we're talking about through here.
Fantastically insightful, Rishi. Thank you. And just to mention, I think the AAD groups is a huge point. There's been so many engagements that I've been to where it's just individual email addresses being given access and moving them onto AAD for governance is a huge point. So thank you for bringing it up.
No worries. You're going to hear me harp about AAD groups more now. So hopefully that. Sorry for the formatting fonts kind of a bit messed up there. So tenant admin settings. So if you're not a tenant admin, you might not actually have seen these before, because and most people in an organization won't be a tenant admin, right? So you might just think this is something you never need to really worry about, but actually it dictates a lot of what can be done in Power BI. So these are tenant settings, and it goes through here in the Microsoft Docs, and hopefully this is up to date. As you see, I think there's dozens, I think 50, 60, 70 different settings. And for most of these settings, what you can do is say, I want them to apply to the entire organization. I want them to apply to no one, so disable it, or apply it to specific security groups. And then you put in AAD groups here. So again, AAD groups, really important. In fact, you can only put AAD groups. You can't put individual emails in here. And then what this will do is allow people access to this functionality. Now, what kind of functionality is in here? So it's things like publish to web. It's exporting data from visuals, which takes precedence over what you set on a report level. The ability to certify data sets, the ability to consume reports with custom visuals, and even to the level of, can you consume reports with R and Python visuals in them? Can you consume reports with the ArcGIS map custom visual in them? Really, really granular. And even which workspace members can see usage reports, whether they could publish apps to the entire organization, whether they could put external email addresses, the ad hoc sharing dialogue. There's some things you can't, for example, restrict whether people can do ad hoc sharing. You can't, for example, restrict also things like personal workspaces. Things like that would be great, actually. And if there are ideas for that on ideas.powerbi.com, please vote them up. But there is a lot of granularity in here in terms of what you could do. So how do you decide on what you should do? And this isn't necessarily an easy thing to do. So what I'm suggesting is that what you do is you document it and you describe the current settings. So this is, say, a spreadsheet. These might be the columns that you have on your spreadsheet. So you'll have what's the setting name, what categories are under, what's the description. Descriptions you can take from here essentially, and then what's the default value. And again, you could probably see, I think, the default values in here, or get a view of what they are, what they are by default. Current value and recommended value, and actually you won't know these if they have been changed. So you won't, all you can see is the current value. You won't be able to see the history of what's been changed in tenant admin settings unless this is set up in advance. And then what's your recommended value? So for publish to web, we recommend that it's enabled for people who have undergone Power BI developer training, for example. Or you might say we recommend that it's enabled on a use case basis, and we'll come to that in a minute. So that's kind of the governance model that you apply. And then why are we saying that should be restricted? So it very much depends on your risk appetite within the organization, and you really have to speak to the security team to understand what the organization's risk appetite is, and what you need to do to be able to make that consistent with other BI and other enterprise applications in terms of the policies around things like exporting data. So yeah, I think we could look at categorizing these features into being enabled for everyone, enabled only for certain capability groups, so people who've completed a certain level of Power BI training, and we're going to come on to some of these later. Enabled on a use case basis, so people, I think something like publish to web, actually, rather than enabling it for people who are just experienced users, you say we'll enable it if someone has a genuine use case for it, right? If someone is publishing stuff to our public website, and it's been approved and all the rest of it, great. So they could go and fill in, hey, what do you know? Maybe another Power App, a Power Automate flow that looks identical to the other one. They can go and say, right, what functionality do you want? Publish to web, what's your business justification? Once they get approved, they get added to that AAD group that's in that publish to web setting. So that's essentially what I'm going here. So another good opportunity for some of these workflows. Again, something that can be managed just via AAD group approvals. And there is an AAD group Azure AD connector in Power Automate, for example. I think I've put this as PowerShell, but you could use either. And yeah, again, really good approach to be able to then to establish those sensitivity labels. So here we're looking at how sensitive the data is. So we're categorizing it with a label. And actually these labels are set in Azure, and they apply across the entire Microsoft stack, so all Office. So we could do things like say, actually, if an Excel document has a categorization of sensitive, we want to disallow people from being able to send that document to external email addresses, or we want to make sure that they sign in before they can just access it, even if it's been sent to them on email or something. So we can apply all these kind of controls, and they're really good controls, and they apply not just to the Power BI artifacts within Power BI, but also derivatives of them. So if you export data from Power BI into Excel or PowerPoint, for example, those labels carry along with those documents, and those controls will still apply. So really, really good from a security and governance perspective. There's a video here, and I don't think I clicked on show video, and in the interest of time, it's just from the Microsoft site. And actually what I'll do, if anyone's interested, I will copy the link to that and put that in the chat as well. So this comes back to the idea of row-level security, and actually I've covered row-level security a bit later as well, but this is not what you restrict, how you restrict who can see what in a report. That's row-level security. So within the dataset model, you define the row-level security roles and the rules for that. So you want to filter the filters that you want to apply to that role, and you do that in Power BI Desktop, and in the Power BI service, you assign people to these roles. Yet again, it's one of those areas that you can and should put AAD groups instead of people individual email addresses. And then when they log into the Power BI service, the logic filters to be applied will kick in. So yeah, I'm kind of really honing this point in. Actually, the best way to manage security and access is to use its AD groups. So these are just a summary of some of the things that it can manage, and you can align your AD groups across these. So who has access to certain functionality in tenant admin settings, admin member viewer roles in any V2 workspace, row level security roles, and app distribution lists. Those are the kind of some of the key things that you can manage through an AD group. There's different types of groups. So really what we're interested in for Power BI are these security groups. So either security groups or mail-enabled security groups if you want them to have a mailbox. There are also Microsoft 365 groups. So if anyone remembers from V1 workspaces, these were created automatically. So you can share with these groups. I don't know exactly what you can share with some groups and others, but really for Power BI, we want to do these. And now actually that automatic link between Microsoft 365 groups and Power BI is broken now anyway. So again, focus on Azure AD groups if you can. Cool. Any questions on that?
Yes, we do, Rishi. We have one question in terms of Power BI data flows. So can we restrict Power BI data flow access to just certain users in the organization using Azure Active Directory groups? If not, is there a next best alternative?
That's a good question. So I have a feeling it's enabled for everyone or not. I don't think you can restrict data flows. I think I've seen it in here, but I think it's one of the settings that that only enables you to enable it for everyone or no one. I have a feeling that's but I think this setting applies to the entire organization and cannot be limited to specific groups. Again, put it on ideas.powerbi.com. Let's find an idea for it. Let's create one if it's not there, because I think that would be quite a useful feature. But having said that, I'd actually encourage it more the other way around, where I actually say, everything should use data flows. I think in the enterprise BI world, at least, the only connector you should be using in Power BI desktops is the Power BI data flows connector. I don't really see why you'd want to use any other connector and connect your Power BI file directly to a data source. Why not do it in a data flow and make that reusable and essentially accessible? Why hide it in your PBICs? What have you got to hide, huh?
Yeah, definitely a good point there, Rishi. We do have another question from Ola asking, is this being recorded? So I'll just field this one. And yes, it is being recorded and will be shared on the Microsoft Power BI UK User Group YouTube shortly. And I'll put the link to that in the chat. So if you do subscribe, then you'll be notified when it comes online. And another question from Gideon, and they ask, isn't this going to result in a gazillion AAD groups being needed? So multiple AAD groups per app, per workspace?
Yep, and that is a challenge. And I'm not an identity management expert by any means. And actually, I think when I do this for clients, now that I'm part of Avanade, especially, I'm going to definitely rely on some of those experts to help me in how to manage this. But I think you can have the idea of nested groups. So the idea is that you can align the app distribution groups to the group that has read permissions on the data set, for example, because that should be the same group. You can align those groups, the groups of people that it's distributed to. The row level security group should be a subset of the groups that it's distributed to. So I think you could do some stuff around there. I've seen things in Azure AD around being able to have local groups. I can't remember the exact name of it now, actually. But there's a way to have localized management of Azure AD rather than it just being centralized by a single Power BI Azure AD admin. You can have local business units, so for a region or for an area. And I don't know what control exactly they have over AD groups. It's something I need to look into. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Yes, it will. But I think that's better. It's better to have some processes and think about how you manage the AD groups rather than. And again, it's only for enterprise BI content, right? So don't do this for everything. Otherwise, yes, it will just be ridiculous. But for your enterprise BI content, I think it's better to have that than have a lack of control over your content.
Yeah, I totally agree, Rishi. And one other aspect of this is onboarding and offboarding of staff.
Absolutely. Yeah,
from an AD group perspective, it becomes so easy using groups.
Yeah, exactly. So it has benefits outside of Power BI as well.
Exactly. Okay, thank you very much.
So this is a big section actually. So I'm going to go through this very quickly so I can at least cover the other two in a quite high level. But what we're going to look at is what are the components of a managed workspace architecture. So you have your managed workspaces, your enterprise BI. What are the components of that architecture? So you have things like gateways that are set up for your on-premise data connections. You have centrally created data flows, which contain your connections to your source systems and any base transformations or shaping. You have well-structured, performant, and documented data models. So this is really key because your data models drives your performance. So when you're working with enterprise BI, typically this is large data sets. And typically, this is wide audiences. So you need to make sure the performance of these is really good. And Leon's, I know, an expert in Power BI performance. So any questions on that, field that to him. But use the data flows connector to build these. So have these, these data flows can even be SSA. They could be CDM folders mounted from Azure, in which case you're doing all your ETL there and just using Power BI to consume them. And make sure your DAX logic is well written, make sure they all have row level security rules. Even if actually everyone who the app is distributed to has access to it, they're in an AD group already because that's who you distributed the app to. Just create an OLS role with that AD group. That way, if it is shared with someone inadvertently who isn't part of that group, they still won't be able to see anything. You've just added an extra layer of access control. Processes for application lifecycle management. So we've got things like deployment pipelines, version control. If you guys have been on the UK Power BI user group for a while, you would have seen Steve Campbell present a version control solution for PBIXs, and it works very well with Fin reports. So where you've just got check-in, check-out of those. Things like that should definitely apply. Reports published to SAP using AD groups, access to content managed using AD groups, and monitoring performance of artifacts managed by central teams. So again, going to go through these very quickly, but we've got gateways. We've got different types of gateways. Gateways are actually very simple conceptually. It's just a bit of software on a virtual machine in your on-premise, within the same VNet as your on-premise or an on-premise server. That just you sign in with your Power BI account, and then it registers that gateway to your tenant, and you can then just set up data sources, and you can set up users for those data sources. And one of the things I really like about gateways from a governance perspective is that the credentials are held within the gateway service. So if I'm a user, if I've been added as a user, and again, I think groups here again, if I'm in the group that's been added as a users to access, who has access to that data source, let's say a database, I could just put that server name and the database name in a new data flow, and it will populate the credentials for me automatically because I'm a user of it and it's held. So I'm not having to request credentials to connect to my data source, even to create a data flow that connects to that data. So things like that, again, really good from a governance perspective if you're using those. Shared data sets, data flows. So data flows, just a difference between them. Data flows is your data tables from source, either raw or with some base transformations, and your data sets are the full data model behind it, including that data, but also the relationships, the calculations, and row-level security roles. So this is kind of what I was touching on with before with data flows. But actually, what you could do, there's 3 ways you can have. So data flows, what it does is it connects to your data. So it connects to, say, your database, brings that data, applies any transformations to it, and then essentially outputs that data, that transformed data, as CSV files in Azure Data Lake. And it does that regardless. So that all data flows do that. But by default, that Data Lake storage account is managed behind the scenes by Microsoft. But what you can do is bring your own lake where you can say, I want to point it to this storage account. The advantage of doing that is that you can then make that data available, that clean, conformed data available to, say, data scientists who want to use it, or to other Azure processes or anywhere else. So you've got that data there as well. So that's your kind of explicit data lake. And then Power Query Online is kind of the default option where it does everything and it's just in a managed service. So creating data flows, if anyone hasn't done it, it's within a workspace, create data flow. Sorry for the grainy images there. Define new images, define new entities. We can then connect to online data sources. We can also copy and paste an M code, and then we can actually copy the queries themselves once we're in the query editor window here as well. So again, it's quite easy. I think there's even an external tool for it to transform Power Query data flows in desktop, Power Query queries in desktop into data flows. Apply the transformations. We can set refresh schedules for them like we had with data sets. And if you want to edit the data flow, if you're not the creator, you have to go in and take it over and then re-enter credentials. So at the moment, there's only one person. You can't assign a group of people to be able to edit data flows at the moment. And once they're set up, you can then just go to Power BI Desktop, get data, Power BI data flows, and you'll see all of the ones that you have at least viewer rights on. So actually, you don't even need a high level of permissions on the workspace in order to see and use the data flows that are in there. So again, what we can do is have, for your enterprise BI workspaces, have a group of users who are going to be using these data flows, have them as a viewer role on that workspace, and then they can access the data flows in there. Sharing data sets. It's a little bit more complicated with the process of this because we've got you need to have build permissions. So either you assign those people to a contributor role or admin role or member role in the workspace, or again you could assign them directly on data sets, and you can assign build permissions. I think Microsoft have made it far too easy to assign build permissions because you could also do it via ad hoc sharing or via sharing apps, but I think this is a much better way to do it. And again, AAD groups, and align those AAD groups. So use the same groups who are viewing it, who need to have access to the data. Those are your developers, and the people who are viewing shared reports based on shared data sets in another workspace need read permissions on there. Oh, did that happen? And then, developers can use these to do that. So endorsements. So there's two types of endorsements, promotion and certification. The real difference is that promotion anyone can do, and certification, you have to be a member of that AAD group that's in the tenant admin settings. So it's a higher level of certification. All of the in order to mark a data set report as certified, you should have a bit of a process working with the Centre of Excellence team to perform a best practice review. So for example, to make sure the data sets are built properly into star schema, it doesn't have redundant columns and measures, and it has well-written DAX. And you can use things like Tabular Editor Best Practice Analyzer to automate the checks that you can apply on there. And then you can have thin reports connected to those, and you can also have composite models, direct query. And again, this is for team and personal BI. So team and personal BI, you might have your own logic, you might have your own data, but you can still connect to the enterprise BI workspaces, these shared data sets in there, use those as a basis, and then build upon it. And actually, maybe go back to the data set owner. If you're building in something that'll be useful for other people, see if you could build it into the main enterprise data model instead as well, after you've built your kind of POC on it. Use report templates and themes, so .json files for your colors and things like that, which you can do from Power BI Tips Generator. This slide is actually quite a popular one. It's not what I built. It's from Blue Granite's website, but it shows actually how you can organize your workspaces into, say, data workspaces. So we have data workspaces where we have corporate data, and maybe most people in the organization, or almost everyone in the organization, has access to this because it's just common data flows that can be used across anyone. So these can sit in their own workspace and give broad access viewer rights to this, and people can just use that data flows whatever. I mean, in the future, very soon, I think they'll be able to use it in Excel even. And then you've got workspaces that contain your accounting data, in this case, your specific subject matter data. So it contains those data flows and data sets. So the people who need access to this workspace are the Power BI report developers. So they can access the data flows, and then they can publish their data sets to this workspace as well. So subject matter experts and data modelers. And then this is sits in your enterprise BI, and then you've got other workspaces which can be enterprise BI if they're going to a wide audience, if they're need to be built with a certain rigor, or could be team personal BI. They can connect into that data set, live connection, and build workspace. And then you have one workspace here, one report workspace per app, because it's one workspace per app. So if you've got the report going to different audiences, you just have some different workspaces. And if you've got the same content across those workspaces, a good way to do that is to actually, rather than publishing the file from Power BI Desktop, you connect to it, connect to the PBIX file that's stored on OneDrive, and that way it creates a connection to it. So that's quite useful. And again, maybe we'll have to pick that up in a bit more detail later on. Real level security we've gone through, apps we've gone through why they're important, but you've got things like custom branding navigation as well. There's other benefits. and direct query connections we talked through, subscriptions, alerts. It's not necessarily a governance point. It's a feature for people to use. AD external sharing is managed in the same way. So by default, there's two ways of sharing. You can have ad hoc invites, which is where you can go in and put email addresses in, external email addresses even by default, into the share dialog. That's ad hoc invites, and actually I would recommend that that's disabled in the tenant admin settings. So instead, what you could do is planned invites, where you go into Azure AD, you add the user as a guest user, add them into the right security groups they need to be added into, and then those security groups are part of the app distributions. You might have two here, one internal, one external audiences. That way you can see who's got access to external content. It's, again, much just easier to manage. Bear in mind that that guest user must have a license to view the content. So either you can give them one because they're a user in your AD. They could bring their own. So if they have their own license, that's fine too. Or the content needs to be hosted on Power BI Premium. So this might be actually one of the use cases. If you're sharing with external audiences, that's one of the use cases for managed workspaces and premium capacity. And therefore, that's actually not an issue in that case. Workspace membership. So yeah, we talked about some of the roles there. Data discoverability. Again, this is a fairly new thing, but as part of the endorsement and discovery settings in a data set, you can say make this discoverable. So that way, even if people haven't been distributed the data set through a workspace access or through an app, they can actually see the data in there. I don't think you can search the metadata of those data sets yet, but you can do that using the scanner APIs. So then they can see the data sets that they have. And if they don't have access to them, you can define the instructions that come up here for how they get access to it. So again, it will say in our case, oh, you need to be added to the right AD group. Fill in this form, select the right data set and what you want to do. Do you want to see the reports at the end of it? Do you want to actually access to the actual data? And then if that gets approved, you'll get access to it. Featured tables, another great thing for data discoverability. So this is where you've got your dimensions in Power BI and they come up as items in Excel. So again, really, really good to be able to do that. Application lifecycle management. So we've got a few things here. So we've got deployment pipelines, data model management. So you can do things like manage those enterprise BI data models using things like XML endpoints. You can split it out into JSON files or a BIM file, and then manage that through Azure DevOps, like you've done in the traditional, development world. And you've also got things like version control. So if you have your PBIX files on there, as I say, have a look at Steve Campbell's solution for this. And yeah, this is an example that we've done in Power Platform Finance. I won't go into it now, but essentially how you can, have those different data flows, data sets, and then different people connecting to it and getting access to different areas. So not one for now. Cool. Of course, we've got 3 minutes left to 2 more topics. They are smaller topics, but how do you want to do this, Leon? We can run a little bit over if that's okay. I don't have an issue with that.
Yep, no problem at all.
Brilliant. Okay. So, any questions before we move on to this one?
We do have one. It's more of a general question, which I'll post to you if you want to take it, Rishi. So this one comes from McCall, and they say that they're from India and they want to start their career in Power BI.
Right.
So there's a lot of companies who want experienced candidates. So as a fresher, what would you recommend to do to join a company?
I mean, one of the things I'd recommend is get some data, open data that interests you. There's data.world, there's tons of Azure open data sets. There's, I think it has billions of row data on New York City taxis. If you want to work with a really large data set and you're really into the data model and management side of things, there's loads of data sets out there. Find something that interests you and start to build some reports, and then publish those to the data stories gallery and get some feedback from people on it and improve it. And that will carry more weight when you apply for a role as a Power BI analyst than actually just a CV, and probably even more weight than just saying, you've sat an exam on Power BI. For me, when I'm recruiting people and interviewing, I really like people who've got involved in the community, who've published their own reports, and done things like that, because it really shows that appetite for learning. And to be honest, that's the biggest thing. You're not going to know everything on Power BI. I've been working with Power BI every day for the last 4, 5, 6 years, and there is so much about Power BI I don't know. So manage expectations, what you're going to learn, and don't beat yourself up over not knowing everything about Power BI, because you'll be beating yourself up for a very long time, and instead just focus on a continual learning and demonstrate to potential employers that you have that appetite for growth and for learning.
Fantastic. I'll just give us a small plug there as well. So our sponsors, Onyx Data, they hold a monthly data DNA challenge, which is visualization of data with freely available data sets to the community. So we've just put the link to the new group into the chat. And so we have a question from Steve Campbell. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Great. Hi, Steve.
And he said he's not had too much time to play with the scanner APIs. First thoughts are that they look great. Have you used them much, and what are your thoughts on them, Rishi?
So no, I haven't used them yet, but I actually plan to try and implement a solution for a client, and I'm actually going to look at this next week. So come back to me in a week's time, and let's compare notes.
Fantastic. And one last question from Rocky. Can we embed a Power BI report to external websites? If yes, what is the way?
Right. So okay, there's 3 ways you can do it. So one is publish to web. So what you can do is, if you're, and again, this is something that could be restricted because you don't necessarily want people doing this with all your data, is you could just make it accessible via a URL or an embed code, and you just go to file in a report and just say export to publish to web, and it will create that URL for you. And then anyone in the world with that URL can just access that report with that URL. So there's no authentication, no security, which is great, but also potentially a little bit terrifying if that's not your intention. So the other thing you can do is Power BI embedded. Now this is a more secure way of doing it. Oh, sorry, actually the second way is in between. Actually, it's where you need to, it's available via URL or embed code, but someone has to sign in and needs access to it, so it authenticates via Azure AD. That's your kind of second way. Your third way is to use Power BI embedded, and I've got an example of that here. Actually, if I log in on my website, so what I did is I built reports on quiz analytics. So all the quizzes that people have taken on this website, I'm capturing using ADF and putting it into a SQL database, building a Power BI report on top of it, and then I'm embedding that report back in here. So if we go into here, what we should see is this report now in here, embedded within here, and this is Power BI embedded. So it's I don't need a Power BI license to view this, like publish to web. I don't need a license, but it's got my own authentication mechanism. So here, because I've logged into this site and I've passed in my user ID into here, it knows who I am. So you can do things like row level security or personalize things on here. Plus, obviously, I can restrict access to it based on me signing in. I can restrict access to me being a paid member or something like that. So this is really good for like customer portals or things like that. And actually, I'm surprised Power BI Embedded isn't more used, because actually what you could do with this is be a data-driven company and actually make money from your data analytics efforts. You can provide that service back to your customers, where you're providing their data back to them. That's what I'm trying to do here with a community initiative, and look across 68,000 quiz attempts, see what the leaderboard is, see how you're doing against it. So there's lots and lots of use cases for this, and actually the framework for Power BI Embedded is actually more powerful, and you can do more customizations than you can actually in the Power BI service. So it's a really good way of distributing external content. Have I missed any?
No, not at all.
Well, I think the last one, actually, I think this is probably what we kind of alluded to before, is that actually you can give external users access to your tenant. Yeah. And then what they need to do is go into, if they want to access stuff on your tenant, they go into app.powerbi.com, do ctid equals, put in your tenant ID, and then they'll have access to your tenant. And then obviously if they've been added as external users, and in the tenant admin settings, you can actually say, do I want external users to be able to just view content, which is the default, or do I want them to actually be able to own and manage content like as if they were part of my organization? So that's I suppose the fourth way to do it. Sorry, Leon, I cut you off there.
No problem at all. That's fantastic answer, Rishi. And that's all of the questions for now. So hopefully we should get a clear path.
Great. So roles, responsibilities. So one of the things we're looking at here then is Centre of Excellence. And what did a Centre of Excellence do? So as I say, it's very much around enablement. And it's useful to think of this as a central team, even if in reality maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's not how you decide to deploy it. And actually, if you look at the Power BI adoption roadmap article, it comes up with a few different ways to deploy a centre of excellence: federated, unfederated, and talks about funding. And it depends who's paying for these people, right? where they sit in an organisational structure. So some of their key roles are things like promoting the adoption of Power BI, so building the internal community, doing learning and training, enforcing some of these governance controls and processes, so around managed workspaces, and approving those workspaces to be hosted in premium capacity, doing some of the monitoring, inventory, usage, and performance centrally across the Power BI tenant, potentially providing a second or third line of support to user developers, and helping with that certification and endorsement process. So building those developer guidelines for an artifact to become certified, and then enforcing that on the content that gets published into the enterprise BI world in managed workspaces. These roles are from the Power BI adoption roadmap article. So you could go in here and kind of just see what these are, but equally you could just read them on the Power BI adoption roadmap website article. Should I just have you put a link to that in the chat already?
I have done, yes.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, this is specifically the Centre of Excellence one, if anyone's interested. Now what we want to do is think about user developer roles. And this is really interesting. Again, this is something I spend quite a lot of time talking about with clients, and it's not something that necessarily people think of and around their organization. But it's a framework for kind of saying, actually, look at those users and those developers that you have across your organization and categorize them. So at the bottom, and it's a pyramid structure here, and everyone loves pyramid structures, right? So at the bottom, we've got our blue belts. Now, these are people who are end users, consumers of content in Power BI, and they're by far the largest group in an organization, because most people in an organization are just going to go in and consume content. You've also got green belts, who are also consumers of reports, but potentially they do more analytical activity on there. So, drill through and more exploratory reports, more analytical ad hoc reports. Potentially they use it more for that kind of purpose. They don't necessarily build them themselves, or they might personalize visuals or things like that. Then you've got people like red belts. Now, red belts are your core developers. Most of your developers will be red belts. They're people who do know M and DAX, but potentially not to the degree that you need to really build enterprise BI content. So definitely for team personal BI, they'll build that content, they'll do that. And they're people that can connect to share data sets and build thin reports and visualizations on top of it. You've then got your black belts, and these are the people who are really responsible for building your enterprise BI content, as also potentially managing some of that Centre of Excellence roles and some of the governance and control in the organization. So you really want Power BI experts to be involved in that as well. So there's likely to be very few black belts. And good luck in trying to hire these people as well, right? So they're not going to be widespread. But again, they are very key to making sure that you have the right kind of adoption, because each level can support the level below or levels below. So that's why it's key. And these people aren't IT, right? IT is there for supporting and stuff. So I know in some organizations, typically IT are the people who build kind of enterprise BI content, and that's traditionally how it's been with BI, obviously. But I think in the Power BI world, these are people with subject matter expert as well. I mean, in an ideal world, you have black belts in every business unit in your organization who also has that subject matter specific knowledge. And what's really key is to align that to training. So we have, report authoring, we have model visualization, Power Query, and then here we start to look at some of the more advanced stuff that we'll do, and for building enterprise BI. So maybe here's where you train people up in using DAX Studio, ALM Toolkit, Tabular Editor, those kind of things as well as Azure, Python, advanced Power Query, administration, potentially. And this is often neglected, but end user training for those blue belts is really, really key. So don't assume that your end users will know how to use a Power BI report. There's a Power BI for business users course, and where there are differences. So again, we can use, when we were talking before about tenant admin settings and things like that, potentially we can link that to this capability groups, these belt groups. So let's, that if we do that as well, let's make sure that we track them, and think about how we could track these people, like put them into an AD group, a mail enabled as your AD group, because then actually people who complete the basic business user training, those are your blue belts. You can approach them with particular communications, and give them rights to the core basic functionality in Power BI service, for example, and then you might have a different set of activities that you want to do for red belts, green belts, blue belts, whatever, black belts, sorry. Think about training end users. This is an example of a kind of report, end user report, which you can publish as part of apps that could demonstrate how to do some of these functionalities like filters, drill throughs, things like that in Power BI. Just again, you can customize that a little bit to yourself, but the Power BI for business users training is also really good. Developer training, think about maybe the DA100 is a good kind of broad certification, and obviously you'll see on my website that's what I kind of gear towards, although what I've done is given much harder questions than DA100, because again, what we're trying to do is see where we can start to provide some differentiation across some of these categories. And to be fair, no one's really an expert in all of this stuff, a real expert in all of this stuff, right? This is from Data Pairs, who she used to work at Altius, actually, Mara. So and she said, well, look, most people will start to specialize in one of these areas, and for me it's probably the governance and admin side, actually, even though most of the community stuff I've done to date has always been around some of this. Self-paced learning courses like this, and I'm glad to put out. Instructor-led training is really good, and as developers become more experienced, they'll probably start to specialize in there. So developer training, developer productivity, as I said, especially kind of when you started to look for those enterprise BI developers, those black belts, think about how you can enhance their productivity with external tools. I'm not going to go into them at this point, but how can you identify these people? Well, think about completion of training courses, badges, licensing. So where you haven't got automatic pro licenses for everyone, then they're either going to need a license to access non-premium content, or they'll be developing content themselves. So if you can establish which one of those it is, as you have a license process, then you could potentially line that to where you categorize them. And look at once you've got technical communities up and running internally, or even external communities you can look at as well. Look at that kind of technical competence and evidence of that, and a willingness to help others. And this is definitely underrated. So make sure you recognize and help those Power BI champions within your organization. There's a few other kind of roles, again, taken from the Power BI adoption roadmap. So have a look at some of those. They're kind of quite related. Tying this back into licensing, so where do you assign people in terms of kind of giving them a premium per user license or pro license? So where you've got premium per licensing benefit, so premium so apart from the licensing benefit, obviously what premium gives you access to is functionality. So again, what you could start to do is look at where people have use cases for particular functionality and align that to whether the content needs to be hosted on premium or premium per user workspace. And then obviously if it's premium per user, you need to assign them the right licenses as well. So that's where it comes into, again, users and content. So typically, traditionally at least, premium per capacity has been all about content, and premium per user has been about, and Power BI Pro has been about users. So now obviously premium per user is the blend between the two, which makes it slightly more challenging because there's less of that differentiation now. But potentially what you can do is have premium per capacity for your production, and then PPU for dev test workspaces, even within a kind of managed workspace environment. And when you have, say, a deployment pipeline, you can have a mixture of PPU and PPC workspaces. So that could work quite well, where your dev and test are PPU and your prod is PPC. Cool. That was fifth out of sixth section, and the last one is relatively short. So hopefully we won't keep people for that much longer. But any questions at this point?
No problem at all, Rishi. So Steve said this has been an amazing session so far. And do you have any content in blogs or anywhere else that would allow him to go through it again?
Well, I'm planning to publish this if I can. I need to check with Avanade whether I'm allowed to first. But yeah, this is the kind of the content I've been building up for a while. I tend not to do blogs just because there's people like Steve who do really good blogging and articles and stuff like that and videos. So I tend to be a consumer of those more than a creator of them. But as you could probably tell, I'm trying to branch out into some different areas of content creation, and then focus stuff on like quizzes, on courses, and things like that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rishi. That's it for now.
Cool. So monitoring and support. So this is kind of the last section. So here we kind of look at support options. So one of the first types of support, and probably one of the most common actually, is content support. People want to know how you've come up with these set of calculations, or how to use the report or what it does. So once you have a report in Power BI service, you can click on the title and see the contact, and you can set that contact for a report, and then try and self-document your reports as much as possible. So use things like information panels, and I think there's a link there to a Guy in the Cube channel video which shows how to build an information panel like this, where you're actually telling people how to build what the report is showing them. And when you embed, when you build an app, I think we kind of alluded to this a bit earlier, you can bring your videos into there, or bring Word documents or PowerPoints or Excel files with your data catalog as part of the navigation of your app. And again, Guy in the Cube comes to the rescue and gives you a video to show you how to do that. Not entirely obvious. If you just put a link to a Power BI, so a PowerPoint file or something, it won't just work. You have to use the embed link. Internal community support. So internal community is really important to build out. Have a forum where people can ask technical questions, promote internal initiatives. So I've seen, people do use Teams for this, but actually I think something like Yammer is better. I can't quite put my finger on why exactly it's better. It's more of a community forum type place rather than a kind of personal chats and things like that. For me, and I don't know. I don't think Yammer's potentially that strategic in that direction anymore, but which is a bit of a shame. I know there used to be Power BI user groups and stuff on Yammer for partners and stuff, and it's all moved into the main community site, but adoption's actually dropped a little bit of that. So yeah, many teams, you could use Teams, Yammer, Slack, and I think people are, internal community support is, people. I think people are more likely to share examples internally because they can actually share their real examples, whereas it might be a bit too sensitive to share externally. And it's an opportunity for these Power BI champions to contribute, to show off a bit of their knowledge, to help others, and in turn make sure that they're recognized for their efforts. Make sure the COE is monitoring this community forum, pitching in where needed, and really working closely with that champions network. External community support, even experts in your organization, the likes of yourself and Steve Campbell. I'm not so active on the MVP on the Microsoft community, but there are many people and many MVPs indeed who are. They will answer questions, and I think for this, I think I've put two links in here. Yeah, there's one on here about how to get your answer question, and one that I really like from Alberta about how to ask a technical question. I think this is actually really important, especially if you're asking on these public forums. You need to ask your questions in the right way. And what you probably need to do is come up with a simple example and a desensitized example that you can share publicly. And I've been in many situations where I've been struggling with something and I can't figure it out. My DAX formula is not working. And so I think, okay, let me ask this on a forum. Okay, damn, I'm working on a client example. I can't just put this PBIX in here. Let me just mock up some data that has the same structure and then replicate the DAX formula. And then just by going through that exercise, I actually don't need to post the question because I've kind of answered my own question by doing that. So it's a really good process to go through anyway. But that's kind of I say I'm not hugely active in this. It's something I do want to do more. I just need to balance time with that. And also I find actually these community forums are so active. By the time I go look at a thread, it's had loads 50 responses on it, and a lot of them are really good. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe there's not a huge amount I can add to that. Technical support, so look at your kind of IT help desk, and they should be able to provide first line support for Power BI, but you probably need to build up a knowledge base of FAQs for them to work for, and look at SLAs and things you have in place. Content obviously should go to content owners. the COE can provide that kind of extended technical support for Power BI issues. Again, if they're just fielding every individual query from every single user, they're going to get swamped. So, kind of protect their time a little bit. And if they can't answer it, there's fourth line is always Microsoft and raise a support ticket with there. This is a link to a relatively recent article that talks about Power BI as a service and how it's deployed as a service. And actually, that's really interesting from understanding it from a support perspective. So, start to look at how that could work. And support.powerbi.com also shows where there's things like outages. Last section. So we look at monitoring. So there's a few ways you can do monitoring in Power BI. So we've got the usage metric reports. So anyone who's a contributor and admin, I think maybe even member potentially, or maybe that's a setting. I think you can choose whether you want members, can create and view usage metric reports. So there's two versions of this actually. So there's V1, which is this here, and then there's V2, which is this one that shows some things on also performance, average opening time, unique viewers. So I mean, it depends which one you want to use. And I think you could still switch between the two. And you can also connect to the data set behind these and build your own reports. So that's again something you can do if you wanted to do that. And this is the new version, includes things like report usage, report performance, and FAQs. You then got the premium capacity metrics app. So for premium capacity, you've got separate apps for Gen 1 and Gen 2. So for those of you who haven't come across this yet, Gen 1 is where you had hard limits on memory. So you had 25 gig for P1 capacity, and that's all you could use. So all your content collectively had to fit in there, and you would use memory, double the memory for an artifact when you were refreshing the data set, and things like that. So it created potential challenges around memory management. And actually with Gen 2, they've got around that and said, actually, we're just going to base it on CPU, and you can be flexible on that. So if you go over, you can just auto scale, and it'll just charge you for that 24-hour period that you've gone over. So it's much more flexible. It's really definitely going to be the future. And the reports that they're building on this are catered now towards some of the Gen 2 stuff. So vCore usage, utilization, interactive operations of background operations, stuff like this. You've then got the audit logs. So here you can go to the Power BI REST APIs, and you can see all the activity data for the past 30 days. Let me just show you a quick glance at some of the stuff that you can see from here. So yeah, lots of different activities. These are all activities that are tracked. Now, obviously, bear in mind, again, you need to be a tenant admin to be able to see this. So it's going to be very few people in the organization are going to do it, but it is quite sensitive stuff, right? This is PII data essentially on what you're doing, and under GDPR and stuff, you probably need to make people aware of that. In terms of extracting that data, so you can use PowerShell commandlets from Microsoft. Gilbert's here giving a PowerShell script. I think there's others as well, actually. And I mentioned earlier that Just has got a template to extract some Power BI metadata using ADF. Actually, so I've built a number of solutions using this, and I've kind of started stopping kind of building this stuff out because I'm seeing what's coming with bring your own log analytics. And at the moment, again, I'm not sure if people have really come across this, but it's a way what the future of kind of this audit data and all the rest of it is really going to be here, where rather than connecting to APIs to necessarily bring out your data, you can it will automatically push your data per workspace level or tenant level into Azure Log Monitor, so log analytics workspaces in Azure. And actually, this is where other Azure artifacts like Databricks and Data Factory and all the rest of it write back to. So suddenly now you start to get a really good, consistent place for this. So that at the moment, it's kind of just AS Engine events. That's what they've released as the first instance of it. Though eventually they've kind of said that they'll bring other data into there as well. So I think this will be the real future of it, especially because it will start to come in real time, and you've got this Crystal query language that you can use to query it. It's not something I've played with much myself, but I've seen a number of demos and stuff on it, and there's a template app, and it looks pretty powerful. In terms of monitoring gateways, you can do that by setting up monitoring on the gateway server. So you can set up in the settings of the gateway, it can write to log files, and then you can actually connect to those log files by setting up, say you write to the hard drive of the server that the gateway is on, and then use that folder as a data source for the gateway. Obviously, it's on the gateway, it has access to it, and then you can build your Power BI reports off that. There is also a Power BI report that Microsoft have made available as a template for it, although last time I looked, I think I ended up building my own report on it to get the insights I needed. And last thing on monitoring is kind of cloud app security. So here you can set up cloud app security controls, so you can monitor things like when tenant admin settings change, you can get people can get notified. You can set up alerts for when a report is published to web, when content with a specific sensitivity label is downloaded. And you can actually block certain activities. So rather than just it being retrospective, kind of looking at the activity logs, you can actually kind of proactively stop people from doing particular things if that's what you want to do through here at a much higher level than potentially you can even do sometimes within the Power BI tenant admin settings. So that was a whirlwind of Power BI governance in an hour and 25 minutes.
Well done, Rishi, for fitting it all in for us. That is quite a feat, to be honest with you. So thank you very much for that. I think that what we would need to do, because really, like you said, you can elaborate on these topics quite a lot, and really get down into some further detail. And I think that our user group would really benefit from that in the future. So we would love to have you back again with us in the future if you have availability for it.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I always have availability for community. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. I didn't want to put the words in your mouth, but yes, we'll definitely we'll definitely have you back then. We don't have any further questions at the moment. I think that the majority of the questions have been answered. A lot of people have thanked you for being with us in today's session and for sharing the wealth of information with us.
Yeah, great. I mean, yeah, if anyone wants to ask any more questions, just I'm sure this kind of stuff, you'll have questions when you come to implement this stuff, right? It's not the kind of thing that you just go through theoretically, and it's once you do it, that's when you're going to really start to do it. So here's a link to my LinkedIn profile. Just feel free to drop me a message.
Perfect. I'll reshare. So I did share it at the top end of the webinar, but I'll reshare as well. So no problem at all. We've also shared the links to your Power community and also to the learning platform as well. So hopefully our community will be able to get in touch with you, reach out, and obviously become a member of the community and the new learning platform as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so there's some people. I mean, Trapana's a member of the kind of PPF. The PPF, we're just running a course at the moment with a kind of 10-12 people. And we're just kind of going through how to build financial reports in Power BI. So it's a slightly smaller community at the moment, just because it's to say I'm trying to do some different things rather than putting out loads and loads of videos. And we did a lot of that for the Power Platform Finance last year, so you can see a lot of those videos. But now, yeah, we're trying to do some more focused, in-depth, really hands-on stuff with that.
Fantastic. We've actually had a request as well that we get you back in to do a session on particularly on embedded.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'm not embedded is really a developer feature, right? So I've dabbled in it, but I'm not a developer. So I might not be the best person to do that session. Someone like Mike Harlow would be really good, actually. Yeah.
Definitely, we'll definitely reach out. We'll use the network to get that session in place.
Brilliant.
Well, fantastic.
Well, thanks so much, Leon. Thanks everyone for joining.
Oh, thank you very much again, Rishi. Like I said, absolutely fantastic session. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, the Microsoft Power BI UK user group. So thank you to everybody as well in the community that's joined us for today's session. I hope you learned a wealth of information. I know that I did. And we look forward to having you again with us next week, where I know we mentioned data flows quite a lot in today's session. Next week, we have a session on data flows with Benny DeJagger, again, another Microsoft MVP.
Yeah, he's got some great. I love his way of presenting as well. So that'll be loads of fun.
I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah,
it's going to be a great session.
Yeah,
Fingers
definitely.
crossed, slightly earlier next week, 5 till 6 p.m. BST. But as always, these sessions will be recorded and available on our YouTube, so please do subscribe. And as always, this event has been brought to you in association with our sponsors, Onyx Data. And once again, thank you, everybody. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you've been here with us at the Microsoft Power BI UK User Group.